Richard. Hello, Richard. It's good to see you.
Recording. Okay.
Good to see you. Welcome to the United States, if only virtually. Sorry, I'll share that.
Thank you. It's very nice to be there, if only virtually.
Richard, how are you?
Good to see you.
You too. Thanks for coming. Well, welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining us on the second day of the 2021 McCain Conference. I'm Ed Barrett, Research Director at the Naval Academy Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. Each year, this conference assembles faculty and midshipmen to examine a timely ethics topic relevant to military operations. And today we'll continue our foray into the morally hazardous world of spying. As I mentioned yesterday, although thought about the justice of warfare is highly developed, justifications for defending and obtaining secrets, activities that can involve serious harms, are relatively recent and conflicting. At a time when the relative power of anti-liberal states is rising, it's crucial that we think more clearly about how liberal democracies can defend themselves while remaining true to the norms that define and sustain them. So to help us identify such justifications and to save the free world, we're grateful to have two distinguished philosophers. Cecile Fabre is Senior Research Fellow at All Souls College and Professor of Political Philosophy at Oxford University. She's written many articles and books on a variety of topics, especially the ethics of war, and has a forthcoming book on the ethics of espionage and counterintelligence. Michael Skerker is a professor of ethics here at the Naval Academy and the author of two excellent books, on Ethics of Interrogation, and most recently, The Moral Status of Combatants, a new theory of just war. So to the attendees, please send questions as they occur to you during the presentations via the chat function. And for midshipmen, please preface your question with MIDN so I can prefer your questions, ask your questions first. So with those ground rules, Cecile, thank you for joining us from the UK, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ed, for inviting me to do this. I wish I could visit in person. This is the next best thing. Before I go on, can I check that I'm audible to everybody without feedback? Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much. So when we decided, Michael, Ed, and I, how we were going to do this, we organized the session as it were as follows. I'm going to make some fairly broad setting the stage remarks on the ethics of espionage and counterintelligence, though I will say something about my own views. And then Michael will defend his own account of such ethics. So let me first say something about the ethics of espionage as a neglected question in just war theory and applied ethics more widely. I have to confess that I'm absolutely mystified by the neglect which the ethics of espionage suffer from. Espionage and counterintelligence, after all, are an important part of warfare. And one would expect that the discipline of philosophy, which has something to say about pretty much anything under the sun in general, and about war in particular, would have spent some time talking about espionage and its counterpart, counterintelligence. I don't really have a good explanation, for such neglect. I'd be very interested, to hear from you as to why, that is the case. In any event, I decided a few years ago to write a book, on this. I mean, largely because I think it's a very interesting topic, philosophically speaking, but also because I love, like most people, I love espionage in its fictional and empirical non-fictional form. This is, I think, the only research project I've ever conducted where I can combine my love for philosophy with my love for that kind of stuff. It is, however, a philosophically important issue. Why is that? Well, first of all, espionage and counterintelligence operations are activities which states conduct at our behest, on our behalf, and in the course of which they inflict a wide range of harms on other people, the people who are spied upon. And it seems to me that like any activity of that kind, it does stand in need of moral justification. So that's the first reason why I think it's an important topic in moral and political philosophy. It also connects in interesting ways to other areas of philosophy, foremost among which is the topic of decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. Now, this particular topic has received quite a bit of attention recently at the hands of Anglo-American political and moral philosophers. It addresses the following question. Suppose that I do not know what the facts are, the facts of the matter. What am I morally permitted to do, given that I do not know the facts of the matter? Now, the question of espionage is a related but different question. It asks the following: what am I morally permitted, or indeed morally obliged to do, in order to reduce the level of uncertainty under which I operate? These are not the same questions. They are related, of course, in the following way, and I think that it's worth articulating why. So I do not know whether the facts are such that I am, as a military commander, for example, morally permitted to issue an order to bomb a particular target. I do not know whether this target is a military target or a civilian building, for example. The first question asks what I'm morally permitted to do given uncertainty. The second question asks, what am I morally permitted to do as a commander in order to find out whether the target is a legitimate target? Suppose that I think that a particular piece of information would enable me to find out whether the target is a military target, therefore a legitimate target. However, I do not know for sure whether this particular piece of information, which I cannot procure unless I spy on other people, will help me decide whether the target is a military target. So we can ask again, given that I do not know whether having this particular piece of information will help me, what am I morally permitted to do under those conditions of uncertainty? Which methods, for example, am I morally permitted to employ in order to acquire P? So that in effect is how I construct or frame the question of espionage. It really has to do with the acquisition of sensitive information which the other side does not really want us to have generally, in order the better, that is to say, the more morally, to conduct our foreign policy writ large, not just war, but foreign policy in general. The question of counterintelligence I construct as what it is that we are morally entitled or indeed obliged to do in order to protect information which we do not want the other side to have. And all of this, again, in the context of foreign policy writ large. Now, although there is very little philosophical literature on the ethics of espionage, by which I mean, as a shortcut, espionage and counterintelligence in the remainder of my talk, although there is scant philosophical literature, there is some. And we can distinguish broadly between three different approaches. The first approach is the dirty hands approach. And it goes something like this. Well, look, states, rulers need, information about the other side, in order to decide whether to go to war and what to do in war, or in order more widely to conduct their foreign policy. The means which they must employ in order to get that information are dirty means: deception, manipulation, exploitation, blackmail, and so on. However, they are morally entitled to resort to those means, thereby dirtying their hands. I mean, my objection to this particular approach is that it presupposes that it is not morally permissible to use those methods. that using those methods is morally wrong, although not as wrong as not using those methods in the first instance. I want to say, and I try to argue in my book, that sometimes using those methods is in fact morally right. One does not dirty one's hands in so doing. The second approach, and Michael will say a bit more about it, is an approach that relies on the social contract. I won't say more about it. I'll let Michael do that. In the Q&A, I'll explain why I have some concerns about the contractarian approach. The third approach, as you might have expected, draws on just war theory. It says that in just the same way as we ought to distinguish the questions of the moral norms that should govern the resort to war from the question of the moral norms that ought to regulate conduct in war, we should do the same with espionage. So, for example, in just the same way as war is morally permissible or just only if it has a just cause, espionage is morally permissible only if it has a just cause, in just the same way as war is morally permissible only if it is a proportionate response to the attack to which we are subjected. Espionage is morally permissible only if it is a proportionate means of obtaining the information that we need. I'm a just war theorist amongst the various things I've done in philosophy in the last 25 years or so. I am drawn to this particular approach. I worry, however, that we run the risk of applying to the question of espionage and counterintelligence the very same principles as govern the resort to and conduct in war, and that we are going to do so in a very mechanistic fashion. The difficulty is that, to point out the obvious, to spy is not the same as to kill. Now, I know that next week you're going to hear a series of talks about grey zones, and I know that you will hear one talk in particular about harm short of being killed, non-lethal harms. Well, espionage, there is a sense in which, belongs to that category. The means which intelligence agencies employ in order to procure the information needed by their paymasters, or indeed to protect information about us, are harmful means. They consist in, for example, inter alia invasions of privacy, in blackmail, exploitation, manipulation, and so on and so forth. So although it is, I believe, appropriate to employ or to develop principles for the morally permissible imposition of harm when we think about espionage, we have to never lose sight of the fact that, to repeat, to spy is not the same as to kill. What then is my own view? Well, in the book, I argue that espionage and counterintelligence are morally justified only in pursuit of morally justified ends. Now, you might think it's too obviously true to warrant defending at length, but not everyone in the relevant literature will take that view. The particular approach I take uses the language of rights forfeiture. But I want to argue in a nutshell that although citizens and their political communities have a pro tanto right that important information about themselves should remain secret, under some circumstances, they can be deemed to have forfeited the right to secrecy, such that those who might be victim of their unjust foreign policy or act on behalf of those victims, in turn acquire the right to procure those secrets. And a similar argument can be run by parity of reasoning with respect to counterintelligence. It seems to me that this particular framework, it makes intuitive sense, to me, but I think it's a good way of understanding why, intuitively, there are morally important differences, between citizens and their political communities, and the intelligence agencies which act on their behalf, depending on the moral status of the ends which they pursue. Now, this leads me to make some controversial claims in the book, and I will highlight two. Some of the means which intelligence agencies use in order both to procure information or secrets about the other side and to defend their own are morally justified. These are means which normally would elicit very strong moral criticisms. To give you an example, as you may know, Immanuel Kant strongly objected to espionage. He called it, in a fit of particularly vituperative denunciation, that, quote, infernal art. And the reason why Kant strongly objected to espionage is because espionage, he thought, necessarily, by definition, involves deception. And as you know, Kant had very strong objections to deception in general and lying, in particular. Well, it seems to me, and I try to argue in the book, that under some conditions, deception in the service via intelligence agencies in the service of morally justified ends is not merely, or in fact at all, the lesser of two evils. It is morally the right thing to do. In fact, our intelligence agencies, under those conditions, are morally obliged to resort to it. Another controversial claim which I make in the book, and which is related to what I've just said, has to do with treason. I find it quite striking in the philosophical normative literature that I've read on espionage, that very few of those authors really, really carefully look at treason. I find it interesting, but also surprising. It's surprising because more often than not, the human agents, thanks to which we acquire information about the other side, are themselves members, of the other side. They are in effect betraying their own, for the sake of helping us. So at least this is how they would be regarded if they were found out, by their fellow citizens, leaders, and so on and so forth. It seems to me, therefore, that an ethics of espionage and counterintelligence must look at the morality of treason. And I argue that under some conditions, not only is it morally permissible to betray one's country for the sake of just ends, but it is in fact, morally speaking, the required thing to do. The other controversial claim that I make in the book is that economic espionage is indeed morally justified, in the service of just ends framed by reference to national security broadly construed. Now, I mentioned this claim here because economic espionage has received even less attention than espionage tout court, including in the empirical literature. The attention it has received in the empirical literature has been mostly at the hands, as far as I can make out, of American scholars. And to my amusement, I have to say, American scholars generally are strongly hostile to economic espionage, but in addition, are particularly hostile to the French, on the grounds that the French, and you will have guessed by now that I am French, on the grounds that the French, they claim, are very good and annoyingly so at economic espionage. I actually think that a robust defense of espionage in general yields the thought that economic espionage under some circumstances is morally justified. You might think it's a very niche point. It's not. And the reason why it isn't enables us to circle back to the very beginning of my remark, where I tried to explain why I think that the ethics of espionage is an important issue. When we think about the ethics of economic espionage, we have to think necessarily about the relationship between the political and the economic, about the degree to which we ought to want the state to interfere in what we traditionally regard as the economic sphere. The ethics of economic espionage, in other words, affords us a window into much broader questions of moral and political philosophy. I do not know to conclude why it is that philosophers have, up until now, neglected the ethics of espionage. I'm delighted that the Stockdale Center has organized this conference. I'm sincerely hoping that it will yield more work in that area, not just because it's a fascinating topic, at least in my view, in and of itself, but because, to repeat, it does enable us to think about much broader and much deeper questions in moral and political philosophy questions which behoves us not just as scholars, but as citizens as well to address. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecile. Very evocative. We have a lot of questions already, so thank you. And I will add a spotlight. And Dr. Michael Skerker, thank you again for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. It's a great honor to be on the stage with Dr. Fabre. I've much admired her work throughout the years. So I'm going to present my theory of intelligence operations. I'll be focusing on SIGINT and IMAGINT. The first part of my talk will rely on some foundational work done by my colleague Seamus Miller. We start off with the idea that human beings have natural human rights, and when they live in groups, joint moral rights. Those are rights that attach to individuals, but only as members of groups, like the rights to secede, the rights to cultural determination, and most importantly, for our purposes, the right to collective security. The aggregation of individual and joint moral rights, as well as the needs for certain basic collective goods for a flourishing life, create collective moral responsibilities for groups to deliver these goods and protect these rights, because only groups have the ability to efficiently and effectively and expertly deliver these goods and respect these rights on a wide scale. For example, only large-scale social cooperation can create a secure environment, clean air and water, a robust healthcare system, infrastructure, and so on. So people have individual duties to others that are active in a one-on-one basis. They also have collective moral responsibilities to contribute to the common good. Now, like joint moral rights, these collective moral responsibilities attach to individuals, but only when they're parts of certain groups. Typically, for lay people, those outside certain vital professions, the collective moral responsibility is executed by supporting or creating institutions to address those relevant rights, like schools, hospitals, governments, churches, militaries, and intelligence agencies. Once just institutions exist, the collective moral responsibility to protect others' rights and deliver certain goods is largely acquitted by supporting these institutions. And that can be done by paying tax, by not actively trying to subvert them, by volunteering on their behalf, and importantly, by cooperating with the professionals who work for these institutions. We'll return to that in a few minutes. So lay people have a moral duty to support just institutions, in short, because they have a duty to protect the rights of other people or respect the rights of other people. And these institutions allow them to respect the rights of millions of people through a forced multiplication. Now, the professionals who work in these vital institutions they largely can acquit their collective moral responsibilities by working diligently in their professions, by adhering to properly constituted professional norms. Since these institutions are created to acquit collective moral responsibilities, professionals in these institutions have a moral duty to comply with their properly constituted professional imperatives. Now, what this means is that it's not just a fiduciary obligation to do your job well because you're getting paid, but there is a moral duty, if you're in these professions, to adhere to your properly constituted professional norms. It's through those norms that you can respect others' rights and deliver certain morally essential goods. So from this point, I'll be departing from Seamus Miller's work. Properly constituted professional norms guide professionals to do three things: to serve their clients' needs, to respect the rights of non-clients, and also uphold the professional's own rights and dignity. So if we're talking about the sphere of intelligence ethics, like all professional ethics, intelligence ethics involves the balancing of the rights and interests of three stakeholding groups: the professionals themselves, their clients, and all non-clients, and especially their targets. So in a sense, we can ask three times, from the perspective of each of these groups, what is reasonable to demand of the other two groups? In the abstract, we can see that these groups ought to all endorse norms and tactics that strike an optimal balance between being practically efficacious on one hand and rights respecting on the other hand. This is because everybody wants physical security, and at a low cost in terms of infringements on their rights, both infringements on their rights if they're the beneficiaries of the security-seeking tactics, and especially if they are the targets of these security-seeking operations. I should say that I conceive of tactics as specific applications of general norms. So for example, if police have the norm that we ought to treat people as innocent until proven guilty, that will lead to specific tactics like getting warrants before searching domiciles or advising suspects of their rights when they are arrested. I mentioned before properly constituted professional norms. On my view, professional norms can be identified with what I call the security standard. This is a hypothetical consensual model that does three things. First, it canvasses technologically and economically feasible options for a given intelligence agency. Second, it isolates those norms and tactics that work the best, that are the most reliable, efficacious, proportional, and efficient tactics of those that are locally feasible. And third, and most importantly, it endorses those that are the most rights respecting among the tactics that meet the practical norms, the practical standards in number 2. Now, for those of you who follow this debate in the social contract literature, I am not saying that hypothetical consent makes these norms binding on professionals. Rather, I'm saying this security standard merely identifies the proper content of intelligence norms. It is the collective moral responsibility to deliver security that grounds the norms and makes them morally binding on intelligence professionals. So the idea is intelligence officers have a collective moral responsibility to help deliver security to their countries. It's the security standard that identifies the proper norms they ought to obey while they're executing that collective moral responsibility. So in number 3 here on your screen, we're talking about rights respecting, and we have 3 stakeholder groups whose rights we need to respect. The rights of clients of intelligence officers are largely met by selecting the most practically efficacious tactics, the ones that actually work to lead to national security. Intelligence officers are not doing their job if they pick shoddy techniques. Now, certain efficacious norms or tactics might have to be excluded because of the moral, psychological, or physical damage done to the operators themselves, particularly in the human intelligence context, this might, for example, preclude interrogatory torture or the use of sexual seduction in the cultivation of sources. We know these kinds of things lead to the moral and psychological injury of the agents who perpetrate them. The rights of intelligence targets will also eliminate some practically efficacious options. And on your screen in front of you, you have 5 different potential classes of intelligence targets. But what's complex about this is that not all intelligence targets will have the same bevy of rights. So we need to talk about how certain targets can lose or give up certain baskets of rights. And I think there are 3 general relevant ways to give up or have a right taken away from you. The first 2 are no doubt familiar. You can forfeit a right by violating someone else's right or threatening to violate someone else's right. The rights violator forfeits certain rights that are necessary for the defender or a proxy to infringe upon in the course of a proportionate defense. And the relevant intelligence targets who perhaps forfeit a right to privacy are members of unprivileged, irregular militant groups like Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, ISIS, pirates, international drug dealers, criminals of that sort. For all those actors, they give up a right to privacy, especially regarding their tactical secrets, their work product, because their tactical secrets concern plots that are meant to violate other people's rights. They can't insist on a right to keep those things secret. Let's talk about waiver. I waive my rights. That means I consensually give up certain rights to certain people for certain periods of time and certain purposes. The paradigmatic example is that a rugby player waives his right to other rugby players to be tackled in certain ways for the duration of the game. I agree with other scholars like Tony Pfaff, who argue that intelligence officers waive their rights to privacy when they enter the intelligence sphere voluntarily. They know they're entering a domain where they will be asked to collect intelligence on their foreign counterparts, and they will be subject to intelligence collection in turn because they are handling security sensitive information. Moreover, they are amply trained and equipped with tactics and gadgets meant to protect the privacy, particularly of their work product. In short, they know what they're getting into. They can't practice their activity without this kind of knowing waiver. Finally, and perhaps most complex, we can cede rights as part of fulfilling a duty. So, for example, if I have a duty to give you something like a tool that I borrowed from you, well, that means I've ceded a right to that tool. I can't keep it. I can't fight you if you come to collect it. I can't ask my friends to help me keep it against you. I can't sue you to retain it. I have to give it up when you want it back. Now, we've talked before about how we can respect the rights of many other people by supporting just institutions. We have a duty, in fact, to support just institutions. As part of that duty, I think we cede claim rights to the professionals in those institutions to engage in their security standard compliant protocols. So let me give you 2 examples. If I own a restaurant, I have the claim right normally to kick out trespassers in my kitchen. But I must support a just public health department as a way of respecting the rights of diners in my restaurant and other people. So I cede claim rights to public health inspectors who come asking to search my kitchen. I must cooperate with them. I can't get in their way. This is a way of respecting the rights of diners. I cede claim rights to local police in my basically just state if they want to search my home or arrest me with a warrant. It would be wrong for me to try and stop them. Again, my neighbors need to have competent, just police to investigate and to deter crimes, to respect their rights. So to support the rights of my neighbors, I should permit competent police to investigate me if evidence suggests that I have committed a crime. Now, that might not be so controversial, but I want to suggest to you that we also have duties to support just foreign institutions. People overseas need police, military, and intelligence protection just as much as we do here in the US. So let's say, for example, if I'm overseas in Oxford, England, attending a conference, and I witness a mugging, I am morally obliged, I argue, to cooperate with British police as a way of supporting the rights of British subjects. It would be wrong for me to refuse and place a roadblock in their investigations. So in an intelligence context, let's talk about what kind of roadblocks one might put up. What kind of moral roadblocks might one erect? To answer that, we have to think about, what does a foreign intelligence agency need from me? I'm a civilian ethics professor. Well, a foreign intelligence agency needs to confirm that I am just a civilian ethics professor, not an undercover intelligence operative, not a terrorist, not an international drug dealer who just chooses to drive a 2015 Toyota Camry. They need, in short, to discern if I am a threat. And so they need, I think, to engage in what I call diagnostic collection, some kind of light touch intelligence collection, just to see if I am a threat or if I am in contact with known threats. Now, this is a major difference between just intelligence theory and just war theory. It may signal a difference between Professor Farbre's approach and my own. Intelligence, by its very nature, has to be prophylactic, forward-leaning, horizon scanning. Intelligence officers can't limit their actions to known security threats because they need to scan the horizon and figure out where the next security threat exists. So they have to be able, I think, to engage in some kind of diagnostic collection prior to having the equivalent of probable cause in the law enforcement agency realm or just cause in the military realm. So let's say I agree in abstract that intelligence agencies have to engage in diagnostic collection in order to assess what threats exist. This is something that inhabitants of all states can and should demand of their intelligence agencies. And therefore, it would be wrong for me to place a moral roadblock in the way of a foreign intelligence agency that is engaged in that morally upright action of trying to protect their citizens. So the upshot is this. I think the duty to support just foreign institutions means that I must cede claim rights against being diagnostically collected against, so long as those foreign agents are adhering to security standard compliant protocols. Perhaps somewhat controversially, this pertains to foreign intelligence agencies who are engaged in the basic job of protecting their citizens against foreign military attacks, against terrorism, against piracy, against drug dealing, and so could cover the actions of agencies in various illiberal and even nefarious countries, nefarious regimes. The idea is that inhabitants of repressive or illiberal states still have a human right against being attacked by outside actors, be they service members or terrorists or pirates. It follows that a given agency might have moral permission to engage in diagnostic operations while also lacking permission to do illiberal things like spy on local peaceful dissidents. What I have in mind about diagnostic operations will vary given technology. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but could include, for example, metadata analysis or electronically scanning huge tranches of electronic data looking for keywords, using selectors, as the NSA refers to it, looking for mentions of security sensitive information. These are all meant to assess where the threats are. They're meant to identify as of yet unidentified threats. Now, by contrast, by contrast to these automated computerized searches where no human sees the content of messages, sustained collection targeted at specific people where the content is read by human analysts, or what I call collateral collection, where an innocent person's correspondence with an intelligence target is captured, well, that requires a waiver. Both things require either forfeiture or a waiver. Now, we've talked about how intelligence officers waive rights to privacy. I think that ordinary citizens can be modeled as waiving claim rights against more invasive collection beyond diagnostic collection if they can be modeled as endorsing the same sort of collection by their agencies. Let me say more about that. We can model that endorsement given the security needs of a given country. Now, as an analogy, I waive my rights against being countersued if I hire a lawyer to sue my neighbor. I can't begrudge him for hiring a lawyer to protect his interests and maybe countersue me if I'm doing the very same thing. This idea suggests a reciprocal rule of intelligence collection. Any set of norms or tactics that I can reasonably demand of my intelligence agencies in order to keep me safe creates a standard for what inhabitants and adversary states can in turn demand of their agencies. Now, this might cover collateral collection or targeted collection against individuals who are not members of the security establishment. For example, civilian scientists working on dual-use technology. This reciprocal rule might also include targeting the private communications of defense contractors, politicians, ambassadors, or weapons scientists. As a highly invasive and privacy-infringing action, intelligence officers would need to consider if the intelligence threat from their target is so grave that their own state's inhabitants would consent to being collected on in a reciprocal foreign collection as a cost of garnering intelligence. So, for example, agents from Israeli Unit 8200 would need to consider if the threat of Iranian nuclear scientists was so grave that Israeli scientists would accept the risk of having their private communications intercepted by Iranian forces as a cost of the Israeli operation. A further implication of this reciprocal rule follows. Agency heads have to consider their adversary state, the adversary state's technological development and ability and likely means of reciprocal responses, even if the adversaries are adhering to the security standard and being the most rights respecting they're able to be. So, for example, if Iranian methods of signal intercepts directed at Israeli scientists are much cruder and more invasive than the boutique methods of Israeli Unit 8200, agency heads in Israel would have to consider if that level of intrusion would likely be seen as tolerable amongst Israelis as a cost of intelligence collection. I think in most cases, it probably would, that most people in a difficult security environment would permit the risk of having private communications intercepted as a cost of collecting on their adversaries. That said, this rule would rule out collecting in countries that are not a security threat to one's own country, and it would rule out collecting on, say, politicians or ambassadors who have a low likelihood of having security-sensitive information. Finally, this reciprocal standard suggests that even in the most desperate security environments, that except in the most desperate security environments, targeting the friends or lovers or family of intelligence targets for collection, these are people who have not waived nor forfeited their rights, would be prohibited. It would go beyond the pale. So thank you. That's my presentation. If Professor Farber has time, I would be interested for her to A, recommend some spy novelists besides John le Carre, and two, to talk more about what she means by a target country forfeiting. I can understand if the country is an aggressive country like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, but what about gathering intelligence just to see who the threat, where the threats may lie? With that, I'll hand it back over to Ed.
Oh, thank you, Michael. That was really thoughtful and detailed. Let's see if I can put myself back on here, add spotlight. Okay, good. Well, Cecile, do you want to respond to Michael's question? And included in that, you said you had concerns with the social contract justification, so that might be part of your answer.
Yeah, can I just first say, novelists, here is a fantastic one, Mick Herron, H-E-R-R-O-N. He's one of the best, I think, writers of spy fiction around. I'll try to be very brief because I'm keen, to have a longer, Q&A. Let me say a couple of things. So first of all, actually, Michael, we agree much more than I thought we would. I found myself nodding, a lot of the time, listening to you. Nevertheless, there are some differences. So on the social contract, point. So it's not entirely clear to me how the norm of reciprocity, which you talked about, particularly in the latter part of your presentation, relates to or coheres with something that you said at the beginning and with which I really agree, that what you call the security standard is framed by appeal to rights. It's a rights respecting, standard. So my question really, is this. It's a clarificatory question. I mean, to what extent are agents, and I mean it in a wide sense, not necessarily only intelligence, agents, but state officials as well. To what extent is the commitment to reciprocity be constrained by respect for rights? So my worry about the contractarian approach is that it seems to say, well, look, we have a practice, which is the practice of intelligence, protection and acquisition. So long as it doesn't violate, some mala in sane norms such as interrogation and torture, we have to, accept that it is reasonable, that we all engage in its constituent, activity. So look, if I send my spies, to investigate what goes on in your embassy, you can't, if you send your spies to investigate what goes on in my embassies, I can't complain. I mean, I'm allowed to do the same. And I want to know, on your view, whether it matters at all, whether or not the operation is carried out, in pursuit of rights. So that's what I'm not entirely, clear about. And, I know that contractarian approaches to war, particularly recent such approaches, have tried to square, this particular circle, but I'm not entirely sure that they have succeeded in doing so. So that's, that's something which, I'd be curious to hear more about. To answer your second question, Michael, so first of all, as a preliminary point, I mean, I agree with you that, I agree with what you said about the prophylactic, I like that word, the prophylactic nature of those activities. This does not, it seems to me, decisively tell against helping oneself to just war theory, for after all, just war theory has tried to say something about preemptive and or preventive, war. So it seems to me that, what matters really is the set of underlying principles for permissible harming, which we ought to invoke when we try, to make sense, normatively speaking, of espionage and counter intelligence. To answer your question more directly, and then I'll end, there. So I really like your point, and I completely, accept it, and I agree with it, that we are under duties to support just foreign, institutions. The interesting question to me is what it is that we may do to one another in response to dereliction, of duties, right? So, if citizens and officials of a particular political community are derelict or give us some reason to believe that they are derelict in their duty to support our, institutions, does that give us probable cause to investigate further, by means of espionage? Have they somehow forfeited, their right not to be spied upon, by being derelict, in their duty to support our just institutions? And I'm tempted to say that they are, right? So there is a way of extending, the forfeiture argument in this direction, which I think actually that way of so extended it seems to comport with quite a lot of what you said, this afternoon. I mean, I'd love to have a longer conversation offline, with you about this, because I think that we are on the same page, a lot of the time, which is interesting to me. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. So to answer your question, so the way I'm thinking of this just intelligence theory, this is defensive intelligence ethics, so that intelligence collection is justified by efforts to protect the basic rights of one's citizens. And so an intelligence agency, all other things being equal, is not justified in making collections in the pursuit of an aggressive, rapacious war, or to engage in genocide or anything like that.
Yeah, so I think we agree, except that I would say that they are also justified first in humanitarian cases, in order to protect by force if necessary the rights of distant strangers. So it's not just self-protection, it's ensuing. Second, I think there are really interesting questions that arise when we start talking about offensive counter intelligence. So when we protect our own secrets by deceiving the enemy. So World War II is a mine for fantastic examples of that.
Right, and I would include offensive operations, let's say putting out disinformation to the enemy. That's all as a means of defense. And just what I'm precluding
I see. Okay.
Is we just want to invade this country to get its gold mines, and therefore we're going to engage in intelligence collections for that purpose.
Okay, so we agree. I think we really agree there. Okay, great.
Well, I have some good questions from the audience. The first is from Midshipman Carson Hillier. And to both of you, Michael and Cecile, given your different approaches, or somewhat different approaches, how would you answer this question? Could spying on an ally ever be morally permissible? So how do you justify that, respectively?
Do you want to go first, Michael?
Sure, thank you. I would say that if your ally is withholding information that you really feel you need to know to defend your own country, and they are failing in their basic obligation of allyship in sharing that to you, then it's justified. And it seems like there has to be some diagnostic collection just to see if your allies are really being forthright with you and sharing the kinds of things they promise to share with you.
So I agree, and I would add, to that the fact that quite often, an alliance is made for the sake of, short-term expediency, and you might have some reason for believing that your ally today might turn, into your lethal, enemy, now, which is why partly why the Soviet and German intelligence agencies relentlessly spied on one another. Even in that short period at the beginning of the Second World War, 2 years or so, when they were allies. So yeah, the answer is yes, and I think it's a fantastic question, by the way.
Yeah. So Michael, then your answer is basically necessity based, right? You have the right to do what's necessary.
Necessity ultimately to protect your people. That's always the underlying thing.
Yeah, in the diagnostic realm.
But there's also an added justification of a breach of promise, assuming that allies have come to an agreement about intelligence sharing. If you feel like your ally is breaching that contract, then you have an added reason, added justification to engage in collection.
Okay. And then there was a question then about, related to this then, could you say more about the limits of diagnostic collection? What are the justified measures involved in that class of intel?
Yeah, so they're going to, the actual methods will vary based on the agent's technological ability. So there's a scene in, I'll give you two things. There's a scene in The Lives of Others where in the Stasi in the 80s is systematically steaming open envelopes, apparently envelopes of like everyone, and just reading through the contents just to see randomly if there's a security threat. And at least as late as 2010, the Uzbek KGB, some of you have heard this anecdote, would tape all of the calls of any foreigner in Dushanbe and then listen to those calls. And so those two are both very invasive, but I was thinking about this morning, those are both diagnostic and they're just looking randomly. They have a kind of dragnet out there looking for potential threats. Those are really problematic because they're so privacy invasive. Ideally, a state would want a more removed and technological solution wherein, for example, computers scan with selectors huge tranches of information and there's no person reading it until there's a very, very high likelihood that it is a security threat. So there's no, I think there's no hard and fast distinction about what technique would count as diagnostic. It's about the purpose of diagnostic technique. And the security standard would press agencies to constantly refine their diagnostic approaches to be more and more rights respecting.
Okay. But a less developed country with less technological means then could use less rights respecting diagnostic collection methods?
Conceivably, you know, if they have a legitimate security concern. I mean, like if it's like Suriname, I don't think they have any natural enemies. But, you know, if it's Iran, they've got a lot of enemies and they may not have the technological ability to do the same thing the NSA or GCHQ does. So they would be permitted to engage in their best state-of-the-art diagnostic collection, even if it's not as light touch as some NATO countries would engage in.
Okay, thank you. Well, here's a question from Midshipman Adam Ibrahim, and I think it's related to this this uneven standard question or discussion that we just had. So the question is, when considering the circumstance of uneven standards and rules of engagement, such as the U.S. against a terrorist group, do the moral and ethical justifications change? If so, how would they?
I'm not sure if I'm understanding Midshipman Ibrahim's question.
Yeah, because in that situation, I mean, you have a confirmed aggressor, right?
No, may I have a try?
Go ahead.
So are you you the Midshipman Ibrahim? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, hi. Is that you on the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So are you in effect asking, you know, whether well, you might be asking, you know, two things, and I'm not quite sure which one of the two. You might be asking or speculating that a country like the United States, you know, faced with this particular kind of, you know, adversary, might have more latitude to engage in various otherwise morally reprehensible tactics than it would have, you know, if it were a different kind of, you know, enemy. So, you know, here is an example, not from espionage. If we conventional, you know, powers, you know, are faced with a group which uses, in the context of urban, you know, guerrilla warfare, you know, uses civilians as shields, well then, you know, if we abide by the constraints of use in bello, we are hampered, you know, in what we can do, right? And so we, faced with that enemy, we are morally entitled, you know, to be more lax with respect, in bello. That's one way of understanding your question. The other way of understanding your question looks at it from the other side and asks, is it the case that such a group, precisely because it is, at least in conventional military terms, so much weaker than the United States, morally entitled, to use means which it wouldn't, be morally entitled to do, whilst at the same time the US has to stick, to in bello? Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am. So my question is more, so yeah, it was more like the latter, especially considering that, especially considering asymmetrical warfare, like I learned in the class I'm taking, asymmetrical warfare, where such as a threat such as like terrorism, for example, like, okay, maybe they'll have different strategies and different ways of approaching or attacking an actual state that has much higher capabilities than them. Now, for that state in particular, is there any adjustments that they should make in order to account for the change in strategy? Because clearly terrorist groups or insurgents might not have the same standards and same rules or norms that states follow, such as China and Russia. So are there any adjustments that the US should make? And I apologize again for the inconspicuous wording on my question.
Do you want to have a go, Michael?
Sure. So Adam, if I understand you, the more developed nation needs to stick to jus in bello and do the best it can to be discriminate and proportionate, etc. Also bear in mind that if actor is being particularly proportionate and discriminate, at worst they're spending a little bit more money, let's say on precision guided munitions, than they would have otherwise. But it's not like they are doing a worse job of accomplishing their mission, because if you're being discriminate, that means you're aiming at combatants and not non-combatants. That actually helps your mission, right? You have to kill the combatants rather than the non-combatants to win. The weaker force can and should do the best it can, but there's going to be a threshold where it morally ought not to fight if it can't fight in a discriminate fashion. If its only method of fighting is terrorism or using human shields, it can't fight. It can try nonviolent protests or something else, or enlisting some allies, but it just can't use violence because there's certain limits to that human rights enforce on us.
So then the interesting question, would be, well, how can we apply that framework, to the case of espionage? So are they, means of, intelligence acquisition, which, a particular kind of actor is morally entitled to employ against, a particular kind of actor which it wouldn't be entitled to employ, otherwise, and vice versa. I can't think of an example, right now, but that would be the analog question there.
Yeah, so Adam, I don't think, to pivot off what Professor Farber just said, I don't think the nasty nature of your enemy justifies worse behavior on your part.
No.
If you are the weaker or technologically weaker party and you have morally upright aims, you're trying to defend your community, you can use cruder techniques, but again, limited in certain ways. There's ultimately a point where you can't do certain things.
Okay. Next question is from Midshipman Paul Charton, and it's to Dr. Fabre. If I heard correctly, you mentioned economic espionage is morally permissible. There are reports suggesting that the United States loses approximately $400 billion annually to Chinese economic espionage. Are there any moral limitations you would put on a country's economic espionage operations?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So when I say economic espionage is more justified, that's subject to the same range of constraints as apply to espionage in general. So what I want to suggest is, by economic espionage, I should have said, I mean the practice by which states and their intelligence agencies collect economic, proprietary, and so on and so forth information about private economic corporations. That's what I mean by economic espionage. And my claim is that the economic nature as it were, of the information thereby acquired, and nature of the agents from which it is acquired, does not in itself, license us to condemn, those practices as morally, objectionable. Again, the moral status of the ends which are pursued, thereby, makes a crucial difference. The underlying thought, is this. I mean, if you think, I mean, this is not I don't think it's a hugely controversial thought, actually, but, if you think that espionage in the service of national security is morally permissible pro tanto, and if you think that national security ought to be constructed not just in narrow military terms, but in wider terms so as to include the critical infrastructure, of our country, and if you also think that it is morally, that capitalism is morally permissible, first. Second, that it is morally permissible that private economic actors should play as important a part as they do currently in maintaining, sustaining, and so on, that critical infrastructure, then I think it becomes very, very difficult to justify drawing a sharp line between the political military on the one hand and the economic on the other hand. My remarks are not tantamount, at least I don't think they are, tantamount to justifying what the Chinese are alleged to be doing against the United States at the moment. Nor do they justify many of the practices in which the French state has allegedly resorted to in that particular domain over the last few decades. So that's the claim.
Yeah, I mean, this question makes me think that at some point, what is espionage can kind of shade then into something close to war, maybe a gray zone operation, to which you can respond with means that weren't really part of the espionage response toolkit, or even war. You might want to argue that at a certain point this is existentially threatening, and therefore you can respond with lethal force.
Yeah, so I think that's a very interesting question. So I need to think more about what is a morally justified response to unjustified espionage activities. I mean, I think I would want to say this. If the Nazis, so I'm thinking. Not quite off the top of my head, but it's just a speculative thought. I mean, I would want to say that if the German armed forces had worked out that the British crypto analysts during the Second World War were working out of Bletchley Park, well, they would not, by my lights, and I don't think by Michael lights either, have been licensed, the German forces, to target Bletchley Park on those grounds. That would not have been, by bombing it to the grounds, killing the cryptanalysts inside, that would not have been, a legitimate response. I do want to say, however, that the British would have been licensed so to respond to German intelligence operations, during the war, and so on and so forth. And again, you can run similar arguments, in the context of economic espionage.
Right. Thank you. Mike, did you want to jump in on that one at all?
No.
Okay. This is a question from Jesse Kirkpatrick, who's a fellow here, and he's George Mason now. Basically, it's about paramilitary operations. So it's for Cecile, you confined espionage to collection of intelligence to reduce uncertainty. So does this mean that you don't see paramilitary operations as fitting the definition of espionage?
Yeah, that's a good question. I restrict in my own thinking about this. I mean, I restrict the word, as it were, really to the acquisition of information, and I do that for two reasons. I mean, first of all, if you look at dictionary definitions, that really is how the word has tended to be used. Second, it seems to me that there are questions pertaining to the acquisition of information, relating to informational ethics, which are distinctively interesting. So I don't want to get into, if by paramilitary operations you mean operations that include the use of force that are akin to war in that sense.
Right.
I mean, I've done a lot on war and on the ethics of killing in general. So I bracket that, set of issues, for that reason. In other words, I do not claim to offer, God forbid, a complete account of what intelligence agencies, as a matter of fact, get up to, which, in particular in the American context, the CIA will, include, covert operations involving the use of lethal force or, paramilitary operations. Can I ask Jesse? Can I ask a question of clarification? May I, Ed?
Yeah, sure. Jesse's still here.
Hi, thanks for this. I mean, I just want to check, when you said paramilitary, what did you have in mind, the use of espionage as I define it by paramilitaries? Because this raises really interesting questions about non-state actors, but I don't think you were asking about that, were you? No, okay.
No, I wasn't. I was asking what you addressed. I mean, that is an interesting question. I mean, one other sort of adjacent that I didn't get to is that, information that would be, so we can think of targeted killing that's been, alleged by the US, right? Or confirmed, right? Targeted killing engaged by the US. And, we know that a lot of the intelligence, such as you described, that reduces uncertainty or is signal human intelligence that is collecting information is fed right to certain teams that are going to use that to kill people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not the question I asked, but a follow-on one. And I don't know if you addressed that in your book or it's something that you've thought about, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I'd like to be a bit clearer about what the concern is. So is the thought that when we think about the ethics of espionage, we always have to be alert, to that possibility. So even if we don't want the information to be used, to kill people, there is always a risk that it will be used, and that in turn might constrain, our very decision, in the first instance, of acquiring that information. So I share that concern. I would be tempted to classify it, as it were, under the heading of proportionality, right? That would be one way of thinking about it. But I don't know. I'd be interested to know what you think.
Well, we have a question.
Yeah, maybe it's a conversation we can have offline. But
okay.
thank you for answering. I appreciate
that's all right.
it.
Thanks, Jesse. Well, Uwe Steinhoff is here and he's in Hong Kong and it's 1 a.m. So I think we should give him a question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Uwe.
Michael, I very much liked your approach. I also think that one should strictly distinguish between economic spying and this kind of security spying. And then I think, also online with Seamus Miller, I would say, if it comes to security spying in peacetime, this has much more to do with policing ethics than with just war theory. And though I like, for example, your approach about reciprocity, I like this very much. I just want to make 2 comments on it that might be helpful or not, I don't know. The one helpful comment might be one does not have to see anything that is about reciprocity in terms of contractarianism. Right, so contractarianism is something that Yitzhak Benbaji and Daniel Steadman do, for example. I have my concerns about this, and you can also do reciprocity in a different way, for example, in my way, and then at least some problems you get rid of. And the other thing I would say is one does not have to describe everything in terms of rights forfeiture. So I agree with you. So if the other state spies on us, we can spy on them, for example, and we might actually thereby do a good thing. We might prevent war because we know the other side is not up to anything bad, right? And this can be conceived of in terms of narrowing the scope of rights, because in policing ethics, also the police, I think you brought this up, can sometimes stop me, and they even can sometimes put me into custody as an innocent person. my right is not there forfeited, but my right did not go as far as that my right, for example, to free movement includes the right not to be stopped by the police for my ID, and it does not even include the right not to be detained. And how far the scope of rights is also somehow dependent on what the society decides and how its relation between the citizens and other societies is. So not everything is always about forfeiture, to put it this way.
Thank you.
What was that last word, Uwe? I missed that. Not everything
Forfeiture.
is forfeiture. Oh, forfeiture. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Good. Cecile, did you want to respond to any of that?
I worry that I've given the impression, if so, it's really my fault, that I'm really wedded to just war theory as the right framework to see of espionage. I'm not, and in fact, I say as much, in the book. I'll have to be a bit clearer to make sure that I'm clear, on this. The general framework is a framework which is made of principles for justified, harm imposition, and then we have to vary our understandings of necessity, proportionality, etc., depending on the context. That's point one. Point two, I completely agree with Uwe. It doesn't happen very often. So when it happens, I mention it, that the language of contract is misleading. I mean, I think that's right. There's too much baggage, that comes with it, which you don't need to encumber yourself, if you like the reciprocity framework. Finally, on economic espionage. So it seems to me that private firms in many economies are so deeply enmeshed, in the national security apparatus. That again, there isn't as clear blue water as we might be tempted to think, between espionage more traditionally, understood on the one hand, and economic espionage, on the other hand. So that's all, I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. Well, the students have to go back to class. So one last question here, and it comes from Pat Lynn, actually at Cal Poly. And it was a question that I was thinking about this morning too. Is there a body of international law about spying that's informed by the ethical principles that you both have articulated? So, just war theory is baked into international law in various ways. What about spying? And if it's not, why not? And maybe how should it be attended to in law?
So hi Pat, what's really interesting is that espionage per se is not outlawed in international law. Certain action, it's illegal in particular countries, but not in international law. And the understanding seems to be everyone wants to do it, and therefore no one wants to outlaw it or be too specific about what should be outlawed. Now, certainly actions like murder that might accompany espionage are outlawed, but curiously it is legal, but each country reserves the right to punish spies they catch and to do things to discourage others from doing it. At least that's my understanding.
Yeah, so I would agree. I mean, there's a very interesting article in the Harvard International Law Journal by Asaf Lubin, which looks at this particular question. So it tries to extract legal norms from extant laws, about espionage. But again, I mean, it's not a very, as far as I can tell, it's not a very well developed, area of both, legal reasoning and legal scholarship. So.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a growth area for the law reviews. Yeah, and maybe, based on some of the research that you both are doing on the ethics of the issues that should undergird the laws. Good. Well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you all for attending here. Any last remarks from Cecile or Michael?
Well, I just really enjoyed that. So it's been really fun, to engage with you, and I hope we can do more of the same, by email, correspondence. So thank you very much, for having me, and good luck to all the midshipmen, at the in the next in what remains of your education at the Academy. And thank you for coming.
Thanks, Cecile. When is your new book about to come out in 6 months or so?
Well, if things go according to plan, April, in about a year from now.
Oh, a year. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Is it still called Through a
Things
Glass?
do
Is
take a long time.
it still called Through a
No,
Glass
so the
Darkly?
initial, no, I'm a not. So my favorite title was Through a Glass Darkly using St. Paul's, and the marketing department won't have it. It's not explicit enough. So I have agreed to the much more boring, in between the screens, title of In Defense of Spying.
Oh,
But
I like that other title. It's so
So,
poetic.
I'll try. I'll leave samples. Sorry. Yeah,
Oh,
I don't know.
I like Through a
I
Glass
saw.
Darkly. Yeah.
Well, so yeah, so did I. Even with an explicit subtitle, they wouldn't go for it. Which I think in the days of Google search is absurd. But try and convince them. I have failed. There we are.
And Michael, is there another is there another monograph in the works for you, Michael?
Not on this subject, but I have a chapter in a book about intelligence ethics coming out, edited by Seamus Miller. It's in press now, and it's where I articulate the view I talked about today.
Could you send it to me? Could you send it to me, please? Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Yes,
yeah,
ma'am.
no, please do. That'd be great. Thank you. So,
But a very detailed articulation of your.
And thank you, Ed. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. A very detailed explication of your security standard is in your new book. Is that right, Michael?
Yep.
Okay, right.
Yeah, it looks like the connection's getting a little unstable. All right, well, we'll stop here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
and
everyone. Bye.
Hope to see everyone
Thanks.
tomorrow. Thanks to the midshipmen.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, man.
Thank you. Bye.